Welcome to R and K species. R and K species are basically like black and white or heads and tails. They put animals into categories based on particular types of traits. So, R selection or R species, and that R stands for reproduction. And the R is also written as a lowercase r. These types of organisms put very small investment of resources into each offspring. They produce many low-effort babies, and they have a very low rearing time. The word rearing means how long the parent or parents stay with the offspring before releasing them to be independent. The types of organisms that would fall into this are typically, they can be insects, they can be things like maybe rabbits. You have to remember that the R species are a continuum. And so insects and beetles and worms and things like that are way on the extreme end of the R selection. And then as you progress through R selection, you get up to some, slightly larger and fuzzier things like mice and bunny rabbits. There are many benefits to R selection. Sometimes overparenting doesn't necessarily bring out great evolutionary results, because remember, the whole purpose of evolution is to pass down your genes. And if none of your young survive, then you failed in your fundamental evolutionary duty. So the benefits behind this are, even if resources are limited, or even if many of your offspring die, then some of them will still move forward. Some of them will still have enough to eat. The drawbacks are that, generally speaking, there's going to be a high mortality rate. Now, this mortality rate does drop the less predators there are in an ecosystem. So something like a lanternfly is an R-selected species that has a much lower mortality rate because it doesn't have native predators here to feed on it and its young. Whereas, say, something like a monarch caterpillar would have a much higher mortality rate because it has natural predators in the area. The other drawback is that it doesn't benefit from protection or nurturing. Parents have the ability to pass down important information to their young, but our selected species pass down somewhere between none to very limited information. They basically rely on DNA and what's written in the genes to teach that offspring how to behave in the world. Our selected babies grow rapidly, are often found in less competitive or lower quality environments, are often smaller in size with a shorter lifespan, and have very early independence. So think about it this way. Imagine that you are watching a cicada kind of crawl its way out of the ground. When that item crawls its way out of the ground, it needs to be immediately independent. It needs to know to climb the tree. It needs to know to shed its shell. Okay, it needs to know what to eat so that it can survive in the environment that it finds itself in. Now, when we mean less competitive or lower quality environments, I want you to think about something like a really shallow, not very clean pond, or a pond that has a very low amount of dissolved oxygen. In these environments, things like that are called nematodes, they're worms, they reproduce in enormous numbers because they can basically just eat rotting plant matter, which is what's found in there. But let's just say that a young mother frog lays her eggs in that particular pond. If the oxygen levels are low enough, those babies won't survive. So again, remember, our related species are on a continuum. The very lowest ones would be those nematodes. They can survive practically anywhere, eat practically anything. Then you go a little farther up the R selection. Now you run into things like frogs and toads. Their offspring require a higher quality environment, but not anywhere near as high a quality environment as, say, a trout's offspring would be, even though all of these things are R selected species. So again, even though they can be found in less competitive, lower quality environments. They are on a continuum. K-selected. K-selected species or carrying capacity, and this letter is written as a capital K. These are organisms that put a large investment of resources into each offspring. They tend to have a very small number of high-effort babies. They have an extended rearing time. Knowledge is passed down sometimes not just from parents, but from great-grandparents. The drawback: if the young is lost, the genetics are not passed down, and essentially the organism has failed. So think about this, something like a blue whale. A blue whale will have one offspring every few years. They will rear that offspring for up to 2 years after its birth. Now imagine that right at the end of that rearing period, the young is struck by a boat or bitten by a shark and it doesn't survive. That mother has now put 2 full years of investment into young that is not going to be able to pass down her genetic information. And of course, K species are also on a continuum. If you look at the very far right-hand side of the continuum, you end up with a very small number of species. Humans, elephants are part of that. Maybe things like dolphins, a certain whale species, where they travel in familial pods, they're going to be way up there at the top of the K species. Then you're going to kind of work your way down through things like monkeys or other primates, down into things like dogs, down into things like cats, and then somewhere in there you slide over into the R species. It's not a hard and fast rule. You just simply have to look at a species. You have to really think about the way that it behaves in the environment. You have to really think about how many young it has and how many young it would be likely to lose in a litter. And then you get the feeling about whether it's going to be R or K. K babies grow slowly, are often found in high competitive environments, are often larger in size with longer lifespan, and death occurs if not cared for in early life. Think about this. Imagine that, let's say, a mother giraffe gives birth to her single calf. Let's say that the mom loses sight of the calf somehow. There's no way that in a high competition environment like the African veldt, that calf is going to be able to fend for itself if not cared for. So again, the big drawback being that you put all of this investment in, and if that baby does not see it to at least its first reproductive cycle, the genes stop with that baby. A whole lot of resources have been wasted on that baby, and the parent has to start all over again in this very, very long process. But of course, the benefits are enormous. Think about elephants. Elephants have been known for parents, grandparents, and even great-grandparents to all live together with the young. Elephants can live almost to a human lifespan, and so they will pass down really important information, such as, where do you find salt? Remember, elephants can't go to the grocery store, and salt is a mineral that is needed for things like electrical connectivity in the brain and a beating heart. And so a pod will jealously guard sources of surface minerals, and they will pass that only along familial lines. So a grandmother, a great-grandmother, a mother, and an offspring will all go to the exact same place to feed, and they will not pass that information outside of that elephant family. I'm just going to let you look at this screen for a moment. The words that fill these boxes are high or low, early or late, small or large, short or long. I'd like you to try to mentally fill in the words in this. You can pause the video if you don't end up having enough time. But if you can fill these in and you can fill them in accurately, then you know that you've really gained an understanding of R and K species. So again, I'm just going to be quiet for a moment, and you can either pause the video and write down your answers separately, or you can just, do it mentally. Okay, here is the chart filled in. Hopefully you can sort of see how the words obviously are opposites of each other. So what is high in an R will be low in a K. You know, what is low in an R will be high in a K. And this is just a great checklist for you to go back to later on to really make sure that you've nailed out what the differences between these are. As you look down the R list, think about worms, think about beetles, think about voles. When you look down the K list, think about dogs, think about whales, think about humans. There are other ways to sort of discuss R and K species, and this is called a survivorship curve. And this just gives a visual representation of what the lifespan or what the death rate of these particular individuals is. So let's take a look at type number 1. We're going to call that human, but you could mentally put something like a whale in here. When this chart always starts out with 1,000 individuals being born. If you notice, the mortality rate of a type 1 species is very low early in life because that species or that offspring is jealously guarded and protected by the parent. They basically have a very low, very low, very low death rate, and then old age sets in, disease sets in, and people die in a very short window. Let's say that for a type 1 species where the graph goes to 0 when all of our offspring have died, let's just say that that's approximately 100 years. So at year 0, the death rate of a type 1 organism is extremely low. At 50, where's about half? Say at 50, you're starting to increase. At 80, increase even more. And then at 100, all of our 1,000 offspring have died. Let's do type 3 next. Type 3 has an enormous mortality rate early. Think about what you know about oak trees. Oak trees will put out 1,000 acorns. Most of those acorns will fall somewhere, be eaten, get crushed, get carried home by a little kid who throws them in his junk drawer, whatever happens. Most of them are not going to get to actually root. Basically, you're looking at, maybe, let's say a 30% mortality rate. Then the mortality rate continues even after the seed has germinated. And until that tree is maybe, let's say, 20 years old, there's still a great chance that that tree will die. It could get eaten by a deer. It could get run over by someone who's careless on their ATV. But once that tree hits that genuine maturity mark, there is a very low chance of death out to whatever that terminal age is. And for trees, you can be looking at anywhere from 100 years to several thousand years. Now, our middle species. These are the ones who have an equal chance of death at any stage in life. Think about a bird. Birds' eggs can drop out of the nest. The bird can not be the strongest of the 3 that the mother laid, so she just doesn't feed that one. When they fledge, they can, not fly properly. They can fall, break their neck. Then maybe when they try to have their first mate, they get injured. Maybe they get attacked by somebody else in their juvenile years. They get their wing bitten. They can't fly. Then in their adult years, the environment changes a little bit. They can't find food. They get hit by a car. They have an equal chance of death anywhere from the very first day of life all the way up to the very last day of life. Hopefully you can pretty much understand which is the R species, the tree, and which is the K species, the human. And that we're basically closing in on the type 2 species. We're getting less we're getting less K and more R as we go towards type 2. And then as we go away from type 2, we're getting more R and less K as we move down towards the type 3. I'm going to stop now. There's going to be a video right underneath this PowerPoint. Please watch the video on survivorship curves.